Hi, I'm Carly.
And I'm Trey with New City Church.
Welcome to our podcast series on faith and mental health.
Each week we will unpack a topic relating to emotional or mental health and walking out a life of faith.
The format will vary slightly from week to week, from teaching, practical advice, conversation, interviews, and practices that we have found helpful in our own lives.
So, let's jump on in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first interview of our Faith and Mental Health podcast series. I'm so excited that we've got my friend Jesse Lusko on here today. Jesse and I got connected, back in August via this pastor's cohort that we're a part of called the C-Rock Sessions. Jesse is a kind and wonderful human being who loves God and loves people really well, and we really connected over our stories with mental health. He's starting a church in Portland, Oregon called Counterculture, and I'm really excited to have him on the show today. So, Jesse, I guess just starting off, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So it's great to be here with you, Trey, and I still remember walking to eat some amazing sidecar donuts in Long Beach with you there at C-Rock Sessions, and then getting to go all over the country to these cool cohorts. Such a amazing thing and really rich and deep. But my name's Jesse. Some things about me. I am a husband, got married really young. I always joke around and say, not everything about purity culture is bad. My wife's awesome. But anyways, that's just a little joke for the Christians on TikTok. But anyhow, I am been married 13 years. I have a 9-year-old son. It feels insane to say. And then I have a 5-year-old daughter, and they are hilarious. Other things about me. I am a pastor. I've been pastoring pretty much the same amount of time I've been married. I got into ministry very young as well. Some fun things. I enjoy photography. We were just talking about that before we started recording. I enjoy photography. I enjoy hiking. I like movies. I like going to delicious coffee shops and restaurants. Those are some things about me.
That's amazing. What's your go-to coffee shop in Portland?
Ooh, man, there's so many good ones. I think
you literally could make it up, and most of the national people would have no idea. So
fair enough. I feel like one that I am a big fan of. They've been around a while, but is Kova. Like I think Kova is just as good as Heart, but it's just less pretentious. And actually, no offense to Heart, I love the Heart people out there. I know they got a big following. They're got a big brand, but their shops have kind of dropped off throughout the pandemic, and Kova has just continued to rise. So, Kova's pretty good in my book.
Okay, good to know. All right. Let's just dive in and go for it. This is a conversation on faith and mental health. So, related to that, with your story, can you tell us a little bit about what your journey has been like with mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my story with mental health. Yeah, I guess it gets more into like the layers of my backstory, but I'll just kind of go into the backstory of my family and everything. So, neither one of my parents grew up in church at all, and they both had honestly pretty difficult upbringings and childhoods. And I mean, obviously everything can be a mixed bag, but yeah, a lot of divorce and brokenness, some abuse, some violence in both my parents' lives. And then they came to Christ in their 20s in pretty wild ways. Like they were actual hippies, like hitchhiked around America, lived in the Bahamas, lived on beaches, like lived in abandoned houses in Taos, New Mexico, and just like, true hippies. And then actually came to Christ out of that. And we're married for about 20 years, but obviously there's still brokenness, and obviously we're all living kind of in the now and not yet, where we get glimmers of redemption and a foretaste of redemption, but the full healing of our minds and bodies and everything hasn't fully happened. And so there's still some brokenness and whatnot going on. And without getting into all the gory details, basically after about 20 years of marriage, my mom kind of just unraveled and decided she didn't really want to go to church, or I don't know, certainly not in the Orthodox sense, didn't want to be a follower of Jesus anymore, and didn't want to be married to my dad anymore. And they got divorced when I was about probably about 10 years old. And I never knew that this was what was going on, but all throughout like middle school and high school, I was just kind of an unusual kid. And like I remember in high school, there was like a bridge at my school, and I was just like a skateboarder, and I told people I wanted to be a hobo, and like I would listen to, Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd and skateboard, and at school I'd go sleep under the bridge. Like every day at school, I just go like sleep under the bridge. One time a kid like came and poured a Dr. Pepper through the bridge onto my head. But I realize now, like, oh, sleeping under the bridge at school, that's called a clinical depression. And I didn't know.
Yeah.
That's what was going on. But then my life really got transformed and impacted by the gospel, and actually by a mentor who ended up being a part of Sea Rock. You might have met him. Did you meet Josh Bowers, the church planter from Detroit?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, he's got a shaved head and glasses.
Yes,
yeah,
he's cool.
A church in Detroit. He was a mentor of mine. Met me around that time when I was like 14. We went on some mission trips together, and through just the power of the gospel and community and friendship, the trajectory of my life really got changed to where I had community, and I had hope in God, and I had forgiveness in my heart towards my mom. And I kind of came out of that depression to a large extent. But flash forward way on through going to Bible college, getting married, being a youth pastor for years. And I still remember kind of like battling inner demons, and I almost just felt like it was spiritual warfare at the time, but just like battling periods of kind of like the black dog of depression, but like, yeah, I remember quoting Psalm 46 like out loud to myself like so many times, and just kind of fighting through it, but never getting any professional help, never getting any medication, none of that. And I don't know if I remember anyone specifically saying that stuff was bad, but I don't know, I just never pursued it. And then on into, we actually planted a church at the age of 25, which is kind of insane, kind of crazy. But we moved to Portland in 2015, and my wife and I, with our little like 3-year-old son at the time, actually planted a church, and it grew. And I'm not saying it was perfect. It wasn't like this crazy raging success or anything, but it was month over month. It was growing financially. People were getting baptized. We were serving in the foster care. PSU students were coming to Christ. Like, there were good things happening, but I was a workaholic, and I was just going pedal to the metal, 80 hours a week. And my mind was just always racing, always thinking about the church. And eventually I had like a psychotic break, and I had what's called a manic episode, and I didn't sleep for 3 days, and I was just not in the right frame of mind at all, and then ended up getting into a super bad car accident. And I wasn't like drinking or doing drugs, it was just psychological. It was like my brain was dumping dopamine, and I was having what's called a manic episode. And yeah, I got in a horrible car accident, got taken in an ambulance, was like screaming and kind of psychotic, and woke up like 16 hours later in the emergency room, and my wife was there, and the doctor came in and told me I had bipolar depression. And so I got diagnosed with manic depression, bipolar depression. And that was at the age of 27, so that was 6 years ago now. It'll be 6 years next month. And my whole life just came absolutely crashing down.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. That's an honor. I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot on this, on this podcast too, is just how sometimes it feels like people don't talk about this stuff. Sometimes. And so when you find yourself in whatever situation, even just like hearing you say earlier, like, I don't know that I heard somebody say something like I shouldn't do this, but I also like didn't like, I didn't know. And so thank you for sharing, because your story, benefits a lot more people than you know.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
What types of, I guess, could you tell us a little bit about like the aftermath of that? Like, what was it like in those like post 6 years? Like, what has that been like for you in your journey of understanding God and ministry and like your own soul care and all of those types of things?
Yeah. No, thanks, Trey. So there is a lot of redemption that's come since then in the 6 years, but I kind of want to just kind of give you the intense conflict of the story. So my board, and I don't blame them. I have no hard feelings towards them, and I really see God's goodness and redemption. I love the story of Joseph. At the end of Joseph's life, he says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." And I guess, also weaving in a little bit of the book of Job, like if we believe the book of Job, like God has an asymmetrical relationship to evil, in that God is not the author of evil, but he is the authorizer of evil, and that he authorizes, supervises, and ultimately overrides evil. But if Satan is ultimately the one bringing the chaos into Job's life, I have to believe to some degree, like, even though it's neurological and chemical and psychological and emotional, if Satan is somehow behind it, I have to believe that God is ultimately, that we can say, like Joseph, Satan meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, for the saving of many lives. So anyways, all that is to say, I don't have any resentment towards my board, but they made me resign from my church and, or asked me to, and I chose to submit to them. And then they merged my church with another church, which was extremely painful. And then we didn't have any like real prospects, and like the only community we had was kind of like freaked out just by how intense that car accident was in the manic episode. So we didn't really have a community here for us in Portland. So we ended up relocating to Southern California to a friend who was very generous and loving and gracious. He's a great guy. But I went in 2017 on into 2018 into a catastrophic depression. And I was doing graphic design for him and doing his youth group at his church in Inland Empire in Southern California. But I ended up, later I got an opportunity to teach at the Bible college, which ended up being really redemptive because I was teaching through 1 Peter, which is all about suffering. But I went into a catastrophic depression. And if you're listening to this and you are in true major depression, I just want you to know I know what that feels like, where I had other little depressions before, but like I remember being at a place where I would just get to the office and I'd be there by myself and I would just uncontrollably cry and weep, and like I was trembling and shaking and could barely function, and I felt absolutely worthless. By God's grace, I never attempted or anything, but I thought about committing suicide every minute, like it was, that's how bad the depression was. And, and I was at this point, I was taking medication, and, I had found a decent counselor in Portland, but in California, I did not find any good therapists. All the therapists seemed more depressed than me, so that was tough. And then later, when I ended up in Albuquerque, I found a phenomenal psychologist. So I'm a big fan of cognitive behavioral therapy and a big fan of, the right medication and whatnot. But at this point in California, I don't think I was on the right medication, and I definitely was not finding the right therapists or psychologists. They were completely unhelpful. And it was an agonizingly brutal season. But what I always like to tell people is that people would try to speak words like, it's going to get better, Jesse. God's got a plan. God's going to redeem this. And those words felt like ashes to me. They felt like worse than nothing. You know what I mean? Like it was so impossible for me to conceive. I had built this church with my wife. We had got, so much attention. We were getting national attention. I was getting invited to speak around the country. And then to just be publicly humiliated and branded with this stigma, mentally ill, that categorization, and to have the church ripped away from us. And I just felt like there was no hope. But what I want to speak to anyone listening is that if you're in that position and you feel like you can't visualize a brighter tomorrow, to me, it felt like being trapped, and you probably know this, Trey. It felt like being trapped in a pitch black underground maze. And people are like, look on the bright side, just, come out of it. And you're like, I want to look on the bright side, but everywhere I turn, there's just more dark thoughts. And I try to think of a good thought, and then there's more dark thoughts coming. I'm just trapped in this pitch black underground maze. And your brain is literally not producing serotonin, and you've got all these negative thought patterns, and you're just trapped. But what I want to say to you is this: don't give up. If you just keep going, you just keep putting one foot in front of the other. It may take 6 months, it may take a year. I hope not, but it might take 2 years. But a day will eventually come, because it came for me, where you're standing in the sunshine, and maybe you're eating a meal with a friend, or you're just taking a walk, and you look around and you go, I'm glad to be alive. I'm glad to still be here. And that day will eventually come. And it came for me. And and like I said, the other thing that I really like to tell people is that suicide doesn't end your pain. It transfers it to everyone you love. And I heard a girl killed herself in Southern California, a middle schooler, and I was promoting this event we were doing, and this random youth pastor who I had never seen before and I've never seen since told me that in reference to that girl. He said, suicide doesn't end your pain, it transfers it to those you love. And I had never heard anybody say that before. And he was saying it about the girl, because I think he was officiating the funeral. And he didn't know that I needed to hear those words. And I started repeating those words to myself every day, and it kind of kept me alive, when I was in Southern California. And so I just want you to know, you want your pain to end, but the truth is, Satan comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and he would love to set you off like a atomic bomb, so that everyone around you gets radiation sickness, and everyone else around you is left with the shrapnel and the collateral damage of Satan destroying your life. So I just kept going in Southern California by God's grace. And if you keep going and you keep going and you keep going, eventually you will see the light again.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, as you were talking, Jesse, I was just reminded of the words of the psalmist. I'm trying to remember which psalm it is, but it was a really comforting one for me in times of really dark depression, where it said, darkness is my only companion.
Yeah.
I think I've talked about this, but I remember a couple times just hearing the refrain of the hello darkness, my old friend.
Yeah.
And there's also for me, there is even just once you recognize hey, this is where I'm at and I am in this dark sort of maze, there is I don't know. Yeah, just it might not be tomorrow, it might not be 6 months, it might not be a year or two. I don't know what that looks like. I remember, Jesse, I remember one of the things you told me, when we were at our first session for Sea Rock, we were, praying together, and you said, one day, the Lord's going to take all this away.
Yeah.
He will wipe away every tear from our eyes, and one day, we won't struggle with this, mental health stuff anymore.
Yeah.
And so whether that is 15 years, 20 years, the rest of your life, or just 2 weeks, for us who follow Jesus, it does not get the last word. And
that's right.
And that's encouraging, but that also is held with the he's with us in this too, so thank you for sharing on this. You touched on this a good bit, but what types of messages did you hear about mental health, either growing up? Maybe they were implicit, maybe they're explicit messages from the church or from other places. What type of things did you hear that maybe you had to unravel or process through in your own journey?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't feel like anyone in my life specifically, like no person in my immediate life. There's one Bible teacher who I'm not going to name who I actually do remember saying, like, almost saying, like, psychology's bad and medication's bad and stuff. But I don't think anyone in my life specifically said it, but I think and sometimes we like to hit the church like a pinata, and sometimes the church deserves it, I suppose.
Sure.
But I think it's also human nature. I don't think it's just the church. I think it's human nature. That human nature is just prideful, and we don't want help, and so there can sometimes just be the stigma of, like, just for everybody, it's like, oh, if you're going to therapy, you're weak, and I think that's actually changed in recent years. I think in like our generation, both in mainstream culture and within the church, it's become more normal to say you have a therapist or whatever. But I definitely think wherever I internalized it from, whether it's just the culture at large or just human nature, or I mean, there was that one particular Bible teacher on the radio, like, I definitely had this sense of, like, no, I'm not going to go to marriage counseling. That's for weak people. Like, no, I'm not going to go to therapy that's for weak people. I'm strong. I'm just going to grit my teeth and, like, trust God and buckle up. And then I do think that, like, certainly when it comes to, like, antidepressants, there was sort of this sense of, like, yeah, just have faith. Like, why would you need some, like, psychotropic drug controlling you? Like, don't you want the Holy Spirit to control you? And without going off on it for too long, I mean, maybe you've said this before, Trey, but, like, that mentality is actually sort of Gnostic. It's not really Christian. Yep. Like, so Plato, and maybe you've shared this before, I don't know, but, like, Plato...
Go for it, man.
Plato said the body was a shackle, and that, there's this higher spiritual world of ideals, the ideal world, and that this world is, like, corrupt, it's base, it's tainted, and that our real idea is to, like, transcend this world, and this body is like a prison, it's a shackle. But that's not the way the Bible starts. Think about the Hebrew Bible. Who makes the world? God does. What does he say? He says it's good. It's very good. And so, sadly, through, like, Origen and before Origen, Philo, the Bible, sorry, not the Bible, kind of early church culture at some points imported some Platonic ideas into their theology. And then there's also the Gnostics, who kind of had Plato as well, and they also had this weird, like, mystery cults. They had the same idea that, like, the true God didn't create the physical world. These, like, lower emanations of, like, rogue little angel guys or demon guys, like, lesser gods, they created the physical world, and the physical world's bad. That's Gnosticism. The Bible says that God loves the physical world. That's why the incarnation is so important. That's why, I think it's in 2 Timothy, Paul says it's the doctrines of demons to forbid people to eat food or forbid people to marry. That Gnosticism is a doctrine of demons, actually, because Genesis says the physical world's good. Well, all that is to say is that just like it's okay to take medication for your pancreas if you have diabetes, and just like it's okay to take medication for your heart if you have, like, high cholesterol, the physical world's good. God made our brains. Like, our soul is embodied, and I like to say that mental health is multidimensional. So there's a spiritual dimension, there's a physical dimension, and then there's a social emotional dimension. And it's like 3D. And if you just say only the physical matters, like an atheist would, or like a materialist would, all that matters, just take the medication. And some doctors, unfortunately, are like that. Just take the medication. Or if you just say, oh, just pray more, and we'll cast out the demons, and we'll believe God, we'll cast out this demon of depression, have more faith, have more faith, have more faith, don't take that medication. Or you just say, go to talk therapy, and just do therapy, and just do therapy, and talk, and talk, and talk. If you only choose one of those, you're drawing stick figures. You're drawing a stick figure, but the world isn't two-dimensional or one-dimensional. It's three-dimensional. And so mental health, I think there's a spiritual component. For me, it was, rather than finding my worth in my work and my achievements and my Instagram following and my success and my fame. I needed to relocate my worth into Jesus. So that was the spiritual side for me. Then there's, the emotional side, and that's, the cognitive behavioral therapy has helped me so much of realizing you can have these distorted thoughts and you need to rewrite them. And then the medication helps, where I take lithium. For a while I was on the wrong medication. It was horrible. But I got on the right medication, lithium. It's amazing. It both balances out the upswings for me with the mania and the dopamine, and it balances the downswings with the serotonin, and it kind of keeps you, it's called a mood stabilizer. But maybe, for other people, they take like a antidepressant, and antidepressants, from what I understand, they help with the serotonin, but they also help with neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to kind of be like Play-Doh that's dry, but if you dump water on Play-Doh that's dry, it's easier to mold. And that's kind of, as far as I understand, and I'm not an expert. Like, I don't have degrees or anything. Don't cite me. but as far as I understand it, the antidepressants can help you rewire your thoughts so you have fewer of these negative, destructive, distorted thoughts. I just would say that no, you're not weak if you go to therapy. No, you're not weak if you take medication. And God made the physical world, and so I think we do well to not ignore it.
Man, that's such a good word. Just as you're talking, I mean, that is like, it's so clear that you have like sat in that, and the Lord has marinated that like in you, like a steak or something. Like, it's just like it's gotten rich because of that time. So thank you for sharing that. I love that 3-dimensional picture, and that, the thing about Plato and Gnosticism. That's very important, because I think, you don't
kinds of Play-Doh. Now that I think about it, that's weird.
I know. I was thinking that too. I was like,
that was not on purpose. There were 2 different kinds of Play-Doh in there. There was the Greek guy and the children's putty.
I mean, great like parallel there. They're like, you got a sermon, you got the 2 different Play-Doh references.
Play-Doh and Play-Doh. That's funny.
So with that, like, how have you experienced God in this journey? Maybe was it hard to experience him? What was it like while you were in the midst of it? What was that like time with God like? And what have you learned about him now, about where he was and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that when I was in Southern California, I taught at the Bible college that I had attended out there, just as like a guest teacher or guest professor. I taught through the full book of First Peter, and in First Peter, he's writing to suffering Christians, and they are suffering in a way that's kind of like unfathomable. Like we talk about, the problem of evil sometimes is like armchair people, but I think it's really helpful to remember that like probably all of the biblical authors suffered in ways that we can't even comprehend or fathom. Like, they were much closer to the suffering of this planet than we are. And I mean, some of their letters were written from like rat infested cells with like sewage flowing through them, or at least they'd spent time in those cells before they wrote their letters. And in First Peter, he's writing to Christians who are going to be like, at least like socially ostracized at first, mocked, maybe kicked out of their families, banished. And then he does mention that there's going to be like physical suffering. And then we know not long after it, I mean, they had like holes drilled into their head and burning hot metal poured on their brains. They were ripped apart by lions. I'm sure everybody knows, like sawn in two, drawn and quartered, crucified, like just like things we can't even process. Yeah. But he tells them that he tells them in chapter 1 that like their faith, which is of more worth than gold purified in the fire, will be like found to the praise and glory of God, like when Christ returns. And then later on, I think it's in chapter 3 and chapter 4, he talks about how like their suffering will be turned to glory. And I just think what really truly helped me when I was so depressed in Southern California was like I had a very difficult time believing that my life could get better, believing that God could use it for good. Like I just had such a hard time envisioning a positive reality. But then I thought about Peter, and I thought, how did Peter get to the point where he could encourage these Christians to believe their suffering would turn to glory? I thought, man, well, I guess Peter kind of watched that happen, didn't he? Like, if you would have been Peter or Thomas or Mary or whoever, and you watched Jesus get crucified, you would go, oh, well, I guess Caesar is Lord. Like, I guess he wasn't the Messiah. Like, Rome wins, like they always do, and like the chief priests win, and like, I guess we were just idiots, like maybe Yahweh's not real. Like you would walk away from the cross being like, well, I guess that didn't work out, right? Like this was all a sham. But then, and that we're recording this right before Good Friday and Easter, like,
yeah.
But then something happened where Peter spends the rest of his life going everywhere he can, telling, hey, guess what? Caesar isn't Lord. Jesus is Lord, because he rose from the dead, and something was transformative. And then I think about the people that he's writing to in 1 Peter, saying that their suffering will turn to glory. And they're sitting there, in some random arena in like Bithynia or Pontus or, whatever, somewhere in modern day Turkey, because they had little mini Colosseums and all those places. And like, they're sitting there and their children are being killed in front of them, and an arena of people is cheering as tigers rip them apart. And they would be tempted to go like, yeah, I guess Jesus isn't Lord. Like, I guess Caesar is Lord. Like, my daughter just got eaten by a tiger. Like, this is crazy, right? But this weird thought came in my head, and this is it. What if you could transport one of those people in that Roman Colosseum to like a Billy Graham crusade? Or like, what if you could transport them through time to like a worship concert in Rio de Janeiro that has 20,000 people singing the name of Jesus? Like, what if you could transport them, for all of its flaws, for all of its problems, but like to just some mega church in the United States on the other side of the world for all of its flaws and all of its problems? Like they would be like, oh my God, like Jesus really is Lord. Like nobody's talking about Caesar anymore. But that suffering did turn to glory, and now there's the largest church in the world is in South Korea, and like this little thing from Israel has gone all the way to South Korea, and now there's 100,000 person church in South Korea. And so I just thought, man, like suffering really does turn to glory, and Caesar isn't Lord, Jesus is Lord. And so that's what really held me up in Southern California, was teaching through 1 Peter and thinking about that, and then going, you know what, God, you did that in Good Friday, you did that in the resurrection, you've done that in history with your church. Like you took this tiny little suffering movement in the Mediterranean and it's gone around the world now. Maybe you can do that with my story. Like maybe suffering really can turn to glory. And I just kind of started believing that.
Wow, man, that is so good. I'll probably use that Colosseum thing at some time. Man,
go for it, bro. Yeah, transport them from the Roman circus to freaking biggest church in the world in South Korea.
Yeah.
That's pretty dope. Like,
yeah, like one arena to another. Yeah, like
exactly.
I mean, that's
crazy.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's like it's as you're
not
sharing,
really mine. That's God.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, use it, take it.
Yeah, man. I mean, the Lord's like, that's the Lord like purifying you and doing things in the fire, right?
Yeah.
I think at that first Sea Rock sessions, John Mark Comer was talking about how pain can either burn you out or it can burn you clean.
Yeah.
And that it sounds like the Lord has really used it to like burn you clean. So thank you for, sharing that. yeah, it's like balm to my soul too, like hearing all that.
Praise
So
God,
thank you.
Trey. Thank you, man. Thank you, dude.
Yeah. I guess like just like one or two more questions for you. Did you have any like key leaders or friends or mentors in your life in dark seasons that like really helped you? And if so, like what did they do? And I guess the tag like of that question is like when you were walking through your difficult season, what type of a person did you need?
Man, I can think of several that were amazing. I mean, and I mean, I want to acknowledge my wife, and our marriage hasn't been easy or perfect or pretty or anything. And we had, challenges in this. She lost the church too. And so that was super hard. And, felt like she was losing her husband probably there too, but she really has been phenomenal. And so I just want to say, I love my wife. And like she, when I got diagnosed and everything, she was never ashamed of me. She's always believed in me. And so she's amazing. Another person, my dad, he would just call me almost every single day. And like,
wow.
He always believed, the Joseph thing, that God was going to like write a Joseph story. He believed it before I did. And God is kind of like, not to say that I'm not going to suffer more in the future, but like we're planting a church here in Portland now, and the favor and the doors and the financial provision that God is doing is just blowing my mind. Like all the Joseph Job stuff of like, that Job got back double, like that's happening. And I'm just like, absolutely astounded. And I know there's going to be more trials and suffering along the way, but like there really is something really redemptive happening. But yeah, so my dad, my best man, or one of my groomsmen for my wedding, and one of my best friends, Matt Parolo, he's just such a good friend to me. And then finally Josh Butler. And I know in the national scene, people are saying a lot of things about him on Twitter. Let me just say he's one of the best human beings I've ever known in my life. And so full of the Holy Spirit, so full of the fruit of the Spirit. And he had all these best-selling books and stuff. He would just call me all the time and just like treat me like an equal. And when I had a time where I wasn't in paid ministry, but he believed in me so much that he would call me to brainstorm sermons, and then he would PayPal me money, even though I didn't want him to. I'd be like, Josh, you don't need to PayPal me, bro. And he would just like, no, dude, you're like a creative consultant for me. And I'm like, what the heck, bro? But I guess the common denominator for all those people is just being there, just like being consistent, just checking in, listening. I think that, just being there, listening. I mean, a lot of us have probably heard this, but like, being unshockable. Like if somebody says something that's like pain and anguish, just remember how much crazy stuff like Jeremiah says. He says crazy things. Like Jeremiah, he's so mad at God. I think in Lamentations, he calls God a deceptive brook, like that gives no water. And like, think about all the crazy stuff David says. Think about Job saying like, I wish I was never born. I wish I was born a stillborn. I wish I never came out of my mother's womb and stuff. Like, so like if people are saying super sad, like emo stuff, when they're in the midst of, mental health crisis, like don't be shocked by it. Just listen, just be their friend. Like don't try to jump down their throat with how wrong they are. That's what Job's friends did, and they were bad friends. And like in the end, God says Job didn't do anything wrong, even though he said all that crazy stuff. And he actually says that his friends were wrong for their weird karma. Good people don't say bad things like that. Good people don't have bad things happen to them. Like God's ready to kill those dudes, and Job has to intercede for them and pray for them. I don't know if you can remember that part at the end of Job, but like Job has to pray for like Bildad and all those Zophar guys, so that God doesn't like mess them up. So anyways, like don't feel the need to rush in and correct someone who's suffering. Like, pastor I grew up under, a great line he had is he always said, walk softly around a broken heart. Walk softly around a broken heart. So.
That's so good. And really just reminds me too of what you were saying earlier about like the embodied spirituality and like this centrality of like the incarnation along with the resurrection, that just like there's something that happens as another human, like when we embody Jesus by being like fully present there with another person in that like broken body state. With them. So that's so good. If you could speak to younger you, like you are, let's say you just woke up in the hospital. What would you say, or maybe not say, what would you do if you were there with younger you in like present state?
Dang, that's heavy. So, yeah, I mean, not to be like too lighthearted here, but I'd be like, hey, you're going to make it. Look at me. I'm doing fine. Like, it's going to be okay, buddy. like, I'll probably be like, hey, you probably shouldn't have drinking that coffee late at night last week, huh? Like, you know, whatever. Just
like joking with them. Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's too lighthearted, but my wife and I, we really enjoy the dark humor about all this stuff. It's like, how else do you cope?
Me too, man.
You have to joke about
Me
it.
too.
You're like, yeah, that was really cool when you were running around screaming after you crashed your car. We're like, we should always joke about that. But anyhow, what else can you do? But I mean, I would say on a more serious note, I think something that probably could have made some experiences easier was like, I took the first medication they prescribed me, kind of like no questions asked, and I was still so like having a hard time accepting that I had this diagnosis that I just was like, oh yeah, I'll take this, whatever. And like, I had some people tell me that I had a mild diagnosis of bipolar because I was diagnosed later in life. At 27, I had very few episodes, and I was pretty high achieving and successful. And so they told me I didn't need to take that medication like every day because it had these weird side effects. But in retrospect, I really wish I would have gotten on the lithium earlier. I didn't get on the lithium until 2020, and it would have saved me a lot of like ups and downs, and like, because I was on this other medication, it's horrible. So I guess maybe I'd give myself the advice like, hey, maybe talk to another doctor, or like, don't be afraid to like explore other medications. You know, there was actually one other pastor who kind of dogged on the medication, now that I think about it. I'm not going to mention by name. He's a younger guy.
Yeah.
But anyhow, so I would say like, don't be afraid to talk to doctors about different medication that can be helpful. And then like, I mean, one thing I haven't gone into was just that a real huge thing in my depression was that, so when you're depressed, you have cognitive distortions, and you have these when you have anxiety and even like OCD and stuff. They're real common. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, and they teach you about distorted thinking. It's like a funhouse mirror. Okay, it could be a kernel of truth in it, but it gets stretched out and distorted. And so I discovered after a while within my cognitive distortions that there was a connection between anxiety and idolatry. And there's a quote by a philosopher named Alain de Botton. He says, anxiety is the handmaiden of modern ambition. Anxiety is the handmaiden of modern ambition. And I discovered part of the reason why I had these disordered thoughts of I'm worthless, I'm a failure, I'm never going to succeed, I'm never going to be this, I'm never going to achieve, that within it I was really like that this idolatry of success and fame and influence and feeling like I wasn't successful enough and I wasn't achieving enough, that was like the root to a large degree of my anxiety. And I haven't, like Paul says in Philippians, I haven't attained or I haven't been perfected or anything. But like one thing that I've grown in the past 6 years, my wife and I both have, is just living in a posture of surrender and just saying, Lord, like, you can be a big success and you just become Nebuchadnezzar. You know, you can be a big giant success and you just become Pharaoh. You know, Pharaoh was very successful and famous. He had all the the fame, and he would have had a huge following on IG, right? Like he would have had, like all the drip and all the swag and all the honeys and all the ladies. Like he would have had it all, but he's Pharaoh, right? And so it's like I would. There's a little line in the Psalms that says, "I would rather be a gatekeeper in the house of my Lord than to dwell in the tents of wickedness." And like, in other words, like I'd rather just be like a janitor at the church, or just like, whatever, a busboy serving the Lord at a restaurant, than to be popping bottles in the penthouse in the tents of wickedness. And I think that priority shift happened, and it took time, but I got to a place where I actually was working at a restaurant. Previously, I'd been like speaking 6 times at events in Portugal and in Florida and Tennessee and Utah and California and guest speaking all over it. But through like just this crazy turn of events during COVID, I was in this place where I was just like serving wine to people and sandwiches, and the Lord, but I was content, not because I loved the service industry, but the Lord had done this reworking of my priorities, and finding that place of contentment and surrender really took away the distorted thoughts and the anxious thoughts of just going, you know what, Lord, like I can just love my coworkers and love my family, and that's okay. I don't have to be in the spotlight. But if you want to do more with my life, that's up to you, And like you can do more with it if you want, and I'm down for that. But anyways, that was a huge shift. That's shift
so good
in my ambitions and that shift in my priorities.
Wow, that's powerful. I guess it's like a last question before I just ask where people can find you. So you mentioned it sounds like kind of differentiation as well, of like differentiation between you and your worth in like Christ and who you are versus like what you achieve and what you do. And even in some ways, like, I don't know if you've struggled with this too, but like also the differentiation is like when you're walking through something really heavy and it's like so consuming of your mind that like I am somebody who like has struggled with depression and anxiety, and for you with like bipolar, like, but that's not all of me either. And so I guess like on a practical note, what are some like practices or like things that have helped you in that journey? Because those I imagine those would be helpful for a lot of people. Like what helped you in that process of like taking that step away from finding your identity in those things?
That's interesting. I don't know. Just as you were phrasing the question, this is what comes to mind. I don't know if this is how I processed it in the past, but it's kind of how I would articulate it now. It's just like, I guess just going to this, like, oh, here's a good one. This is where I'll go. Okay. Is that like the most foundational thing about you and I as human beings is that we're made in the image of God. And like the idea of the image of God is so significant that I have a bookcase full of books next to me. Not all of these are on this topic, but I probably have 10 books up there that are on this topic about how the image of God is where we get the concept of human rights. And Portland, the city behind me, is all full of people who believe in equality and rights and human rights. But all these secular scholars and historians and Christian ones as well, like, from Friedrich Nietzsche to Martin Luther King Jr. to Jürgen Habermas to John Gray, who's an atheist in the UK at the British School of Economics, like what they all agree is that our idea of human rights comes from the idea that we're made in God's image. And that the way I treat Trey, this is the way the Bible lays this out later in like 1 John and stuff, is that the way I treat Trey and James is a reflection of the way I treat God.
Yep.
So like if I treat Trey terrible, that's a reflection of how I'm treating God. That's what James says. That's what 1 John says. And so finding my worth in Christ and going, I'm made in God's image, somebody who has horrible cerebral palsy, someone who's addicted to drugs, someone with schizophrenia, they're made in God's image. And so that's why we need to love them. We need to care for them. But then I guess the other place I would go is about differentiation is that in the resurrection, I'm not going to have bipolar anymore. My brain will be resurrected and healed, and I'll still be loved by God in Christ. And so like finding my worth in Christ, but then also I guess just like maybe noticing parts of my life that are part of the goodness of creation, not part of the fall. So like if sickness and sin is part of the fall, then like, oh, well, I do have qualities. They're not perfect, but like I do have qualities that I think are gifts of the goodness of creation. And so like, yeah, I don't know. I've got other skills that God is, they're gifts. I shouldn't be prideful about them, but like, yeah, I'm a pretty good graphic designer. I'm pretty good at this. I've got kids. I love them. I have fun in the sunshine. I go hiking. I don't know. Like, and just like, there were days, even when I was still battling pretty bad depression, of just like finding those moments where I was glad to be alive. Like I remember one day I was kayaking down the Rio Grande in New Mexico. It's not a very deep river, by the way. It's a very small river. It's kind of pathetic.
That's interesting. It sounds like the opposite of what it's called.
Bless you, Rio Grande. Bless you. But it actually had rained really good that summer. But I was with like my best friend, and we were kayaking down this river. We both had our kids in their life jackets, and it was so cute. I still remember this moment. I just remember going like, I'm glad to be alive. Like, it doesn't matter like what's happened to me. Like, here I am. I'm happy to be in this moment, you know? And so maybe that's some differentiation where it's like, okay, yeah, that day in the hospital was horrible. That day in the ambulance was terrible. But like, hey, I'm not in that moment now. Like, I'm just here floating down a river with my buddy, and it's beautiful outside, and I've got my daughter here in a life jacket, and she's really cute, you know? And just like finding those moments where you can just say like, no, man, this is the goodness of creation. The fall hasn't spoiled all of it, you know?
Wow. That's so good. And man, I mean, just even as I've heard you several times say, it's like those times when you stop and you realize, I'm glad I'm alive. I'm glad I'm here. It's good to be here.
Yeah.
When you've been in really dark places and felt like it was only darkness all around you, whenever you do recognize that, it just like, it feels all the more like powerful and beautiful and like, I don't know, you hold it more open-handed, but like I'm happy that it's there, you know? I'm not trying to cling to it too much.
And I bet you the science would elucidate this, but I think the more you notice those moments, the more of them start to happen, you know? Like and I don't mean that in some weird law of attraction way, but I just mean it in the sense like gratitude probably counteracts the cognitive distortions or the intrusive thoughts or whatever. Like when you take time to notice, like, man, like just here eating this delicious sandwich and I'm thankful for it, you know, like that, like your brain probably, you're training your brain, you're rewiring your brain to like notice more of those moments, and I've found that to be the case in my life.
That's so good. Well, Jesse, thank you so much. No, it is, but I mean, it's like, it's those simple things, you know, it doesn't have to be this massive. It's like these small daily practices and things like that really can make a difference, and that happiness and deep sadness can coexist in the same day, same hour, same minute.
Oh, God, that's true.
Yeah, like that dark humor. That was like one of the few things I would laugh about when I was in a really dark season. I'd have a couple friends who sent me really dark memes that would probably scare some people, but one of the few things that made me laugh.
Oh, bro, I got one I'm going to send you later.
Yeah, please do. Honestly, if you got any, man, I'm always down to see them. So,
sounds good.
Yeah, man. Well, as we wrap up, Jesse, just thank you so much for sharing what the Lord has done in your life and through your life. I'm really encouraged, and I know we talked about this before when we connected in LA, but just it's always encouraging hearing someone else who's like walked through, although your struggles is very different than mine in a lot of ways, like in the specifics of it, walked through journeying with mental health as a pastor, is a husband, now for me also as like a father. What does that look like? And so, all of that. Just thank you for sharing your story, and I know the Lord's going to use it and is using it. I guess as we wrap up, how can people find you and find what you're up to these days?
So if you want to, you can just at Jesse Lusko on Instagram or on Facebook or whatever. I don't really tweet too much these days, but just at Jesse Lusko. My name is pretty unusual. The Lusko name. It's gets me all the handles I want there.
Nice.
Because I'm the
And then
only
you're
one. I'm like Tigger.
That's amazing.
But yeah, and then our church
Wonderful thing
plant
about Tigger.
is counterculture.church, counterculture.church, and then it's just counterculture PDX on Instagram. But yeah, thanks, Trey.
Awesome.
It's been so fun, my dude.
Yeah, man. Well, yeah, blessings on you, and thank you again.